In this video, we're going to take a look at the audio compressor in Logic Pro. There's a ton of settings in here, and I'm going to attempt to explain how this plugin works and what it's for. I've got a session loaded up here that has a bunch of different tracks, and if we've got time, we'll look at how compressors work on different types of audio. We're going to start with using it on a vocal, but it's used on just about any piece of audio that you can think of. It's one of the main tools used by engineers as compressors. If you got to think about what are the tools that are bread and butter, it's going to be compressors and EQs. And almost every plugin, if you really think about it, is going to be some version of compressor or an EQ. All the outboard gear is like that as well. I kind of break these effects down into three categories. You have compressors, you have EQs, and then you have everything else. And everything else is going to be things like reverbs, delays, phasers, all that kind of stuff. So compressors and EQs are very, very, very important. So this video is all about compressors. Let's take a look here. When I load up the compressor in Logic, we have threshold, ratio, makeup, knee, attack, and release. And then we've got lots of other things. This whole section over here is a limiter, and it monitors the output. So the limiter is essentially just a very, very aggressive compressor. You can think of it like that. We're not going to talk about the limiter in this video. So we're really concerned with what is happening in this area of the plugin. We can change the input gain. This is the amount of signal that we're feeding into the compressor. 0 dB represents 100% of whatever the signal is already on the channel, and we can add to that or subtract to it. We can also do the same thing on the output. So let's take a look at threshold, ratio, makeup, and gain. I'm going to bypass the compressor, and we're going to play this vocal here. I've got some guitar playing with it as well. This is not freedom. This is us hiding from them. So when we are using a compressor, what we are doing is we are changing the dynamic range of the audio. If I zoom into this vocal, you can see that this vocal has a dynamic range that is represented by the this high peak here and then a low area over here. So the difference between these two peaks here would be the dynamic range. We're talking about the quieter areas of the vocal and the louder areas of the vocal. So you can see she's louder on this word, loudest on this word here, quietest somewhere over. This whole phrase is pretty quiet. This whole phrase is pretty quiet. So let's take a listen again and watch what happens. So this is much quieter than this, and that's not a bad thing. But when we're dealing with mixing in audio, oftentimes that can mean that this quieter phrase gets lost in the mix. So let's look at what a compressor does to this. I'm going to put the compressor back on. And what we're going to do is, in fact, what we'll do is we'll put on the level meter, and we'll look at the level of the audio without the compressor. This is just on the vocal. This is not freedom. This is us hiding from them. So you can see mostly the level is around here, and then it comes up over this yellow marker, which is arbitrary. You can put this wherever you want, but it comes up over this marker. So this meter is just giving me a meter. It's not changing the sound in any way. Let's put the compressor on and see what happens to the meter. This is not freedom. This is us hiding from them. So without even changing anything on the compressor, you can see that most of the level is much closer to this yellow line. But let's get into what we would actually do with the compressor. Oh, and by the way, that just means that most of the level is louder. That's all it means. And that's a good thing. We can hear it better. So let's get into the actual compressor. When the audio comes in, it's going to be measured by the threshold, and if the audio level exceeds the threshold, that is louder than wherever the threshold is set, then the compressor will start to engage. And when it engages, all it's doing is turning down the level. So if you imagine that behind all of these fancy knobs inside, there's just one big giant knob that's just turning the level down if it exceeds the threshold. Okay, if it doesn't exceed the threshold, then more or less nothing happens. So you can think of it that way. Nothing happens. The audio just comes through. It doesn't hit anything in the compressor, comes out the other side unaffected. If it exceeds the threshold, it starts to get turned down. Now that might be confusing because when we're turning down audio, how do we end up, if you remember on the level meter, how do we end up with louder audio if the compressor is turning it down? Well, we're going to see. So when the audio exceeds the threshold, the compressor begins turning it down. It's going to attempt to turn it down to a specific spot. So as an example, I'm just going to load up, let's see, have an idea here. Okay. So this is just the one knob plugin, but we're not going to use it to change the sound. I just want you to visualize. If you imagine that behind the compressor, we just have one big volume knob and it's turned all the way up, meaning it's allowing all of the volume to come through. When the compressor engages, it begins turning down. It begins turning down. And when the compressor wants to turn down, what it's got in its mind is it's going to attempt to turn down to a specific target. So let's say we set that target to this 4 here. When the audio exceeds the threshold, it doesn't just immediately turn down to 4. What it does is it begins turning down and tries to get to 4. If the audio is still exceeding the threshold by the time it gets to 4, then it just stays there. Okay. And when the audio drops back down below the threshold, it starts turning back up. And this is where we get the extra volume from. It turns back up. So that is turning up things that might not otherwise get turned up. So it's turning up after the volume drops down below the threshold. So volume comes in, exceeds the threshold, compressor starts turning down, gets to its target, and then when the volume gets below the threshold, it starts turning back up and goes back to where it started originally. The target is the ratio. So you can set the ratio and that will change the target to which the compressor, how much the compressor wants to turn down. It's a ratio of original signal to compressed signal. More ratio means the target is going to be quieter. Okay. So turn the ratio up, it's trying to compress even more. Makeup gain is extra gain you can add after this compression takes place. That's where we get the extra volume from. We can also get it from over here, but this is not compressing or anything. It's just adding extra loudness, and you can have this automatically set as well. Knee has to do with the way in which it starts turning down. Does it start turning down quickly, or does it turn down slow and then go quickly? It just has to do with the way, the curve that it's going to draw. Attack is widely misunderstood. A lot of people think that when the audio exceeds the threshold, the compressor waits 15 milliseconds or whatever your attack is set to, and then begins turning down. That's not the case. What happens is the audio exceeds the threshold, and then the compressor wants to turn down. It wants to turn down to its target. Remember, in our example, we're trying to turn down to this arbitrary target of 4. It wants to do that, and it's got, let's say, 15.5 milliseconds to get all the way to 4. So that's the speed at which the compressor is going to turn down. That's the attack. And then on the other end, the speed at which the compressor is going to release, aka turn back up, that's the release speed. It has nothing to do with the compressor waiting before it does something. It has to do with the speed that the volume reduction, the gain reduction occurs. So that is an explanation of how the compressor is working. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's look at it for real and see what happens. I'm going to load up the preset here. By the way, there's lots of different algorithms in here at the top. They all work slightly differently and they all have different settings preset. I'm going to load up the studio vocal on this vocal and show you how a compressor works, like how we actually modify it. So we'll go ahead and hit play. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. So you see this needle moving over here? When I play, that needle shows me how much it's being turned down. That's that big volume knob. It's turning it down. This is showing me how much gain reduction I'm getting. So when the needle is at 0, there's no gain reduction happening. When it's up at -5, it's turned it down by 5 dB. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. And the speed at which that needle falls back down is the speed of the release. Like if I turn the release way up, you'll see the needle will fall back down much slower. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not see how much slower it falls. If I turn the release down, it's going to jump back really quick. Not free. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. Okay, so the release speed and the attack speed can definitely change the level a lot. Typically, what I recommend people do when they're getting when they're new users to compressors, is to load up one of the presets and mess with threshold and ratio and not get into makeup, attack, and release at first. So with this example, I've got the studio vocal loaded up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the ratio to somewhere between 3 and 5 to 1. So we'll set it right in the middle at 4. 4 to 1 is a good place to start. And then I'm going to turn the threshold around until I see about 5-ish dB of gain reduction. Average, because it's going to jump around. It's going to be below that sometimes, it's going to be above it sometimes. So we're looking for about an average of 5 dB.
Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not
So I turn the threshold this way.
freedom.
I get a lot of gain reduction. I turn the threshold this way. I get no gain reduction. Okay, so you just move this around until you get a decent amount of gain reduction.
Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom. This is a
Cool, and then let's look at what that did to the level meter. Let's watch the level meter. If you remember this from the beginning, watch how close we are to this yellow line all the time now.
unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom.
So if you remember earlier, this line before the compression was like way down here, and now we're up way past this yellow line. So what that means, and this is really what it comes down to with compressors, what that means is that I can now take this track and I can turn the whole track up, and the peaks, these peaks up here, these big guys, those will not be peaking the track. They won't be jumping out unnecessarily because these peaks are the things that have been turned down. So this allows me to turn the whole track up quite a bit and get a lot more. I can hear that track better. I can hear the detail in that track better. That's what compressors are all about. They give you more rich, detailed sound. Real quick, before we end the video, let's try it on the acoustic guitar. Same thing. Just to give you the rundown of my suggestion for getting started with compressors. Here's the track. We're going to go to effects. We're going to put on the compressor. We're going to go to the preset, choose one of the appropriate presets. Here's guitars, here's acoustic guitar. Easy, easy. Start playing. Change the ratio to around 4, 3 to 5, anywhere in there. Change the threshold till you see about 4 to 5 dB of reduction. So something like that. And so then you'll be able to turn this track up with a little bit less fear of random things jumping out super, super loud and being distracting. So that's a rundown of compressors. Hopefully you feel a little bit more confident in using them. Definitely jump in and start using them. Don't be intimidated by all the little fiddly details. The main meat of compressor is going to be threshold, ratio, and those are the main things you want to mess with. Do some of the presets here. Change the settings up here to see what the different compressors sound like, and have some fun with it. Don't be afraid of them. They're a lot of fun. They make everything sound better if you do it right. So that's a little bit on compressors. Hope you enjoyed.